I think the reason why they were colouring the photographs was really to try and give the best possible impression of what it was like over there. It's this idea of seeing the war through their eyes to bring home to the Australian public those locations that they themselves had seen. Having these images in colour, it gave you more of an immediacy, an impression of that was the authentic image, that is what my brother saw himself. Captain William Donovan Joint was a VC winner, and he returned from the Western Front in 1919 and he established a photographic studio in Melbourne, and he decided to produce an exhibition of photographs from World War I. Obviously the war ended towards the end of 1918. For many there was a big delay in coming home, in finding ships and getting put on a ship, and then the length of time it took to come home. So there were Australian troops and nurses arriving home through a lot of 1919. And then this exhibition started in 1920. And of course we know that the 1920s was that decade where Australia was in mourning. Every town and city in Australia were planning to construct war memorials, and also the beginnings of Anzac Day. And so it's this whole beginning of a new language of commemoration that really is so familiar to us now in Australia. One of Joint's main aims was for the Australian public to feel proud. They are wanting to show that Australians did their best, they punched above their weight for the British Empire. Patriotism and loyalty is bound up in this exhibition, and what great, brave feats that the Australians had done. So it was really showing that to the Australian public.
It does seem that the idea behind this exhibition and using the diggers' photos that they took themselves was to give a more intimate, more personal impression of what their experience was. It is interesting because it was a time when a lot of research and discovery was being made around colour photography. So that didn't really become viable commercially till the 30s. So this was right on the cusp of that. Although on the one hand you think they were using colour to make it a little bit more naturalistic, maybe too that was partly to balance the fact that they were blowing these very small prints up into these very large prints, and they were losing a lot of the focus. And so that's why part of the beauty of these photos is you have this very surreal, like slightly out of focus sort of sepia image, and then this very naturalistic, very subtle colouring, and it gives them a haunting quality.
These are very soft colours, so even though often they are depicting a devastated landscape or depicting soldiers being taken prisoner, so challenging subject matter, they are very gentle and soft to look at. So it's this juxtaposition, I think, in the images.
One of the interesting things for conservators, and one of the things that gets us excited, is looking at the materials and the techniques. And so thinking, wow, how's this little studio in Melbourne in the 1920s, what did they have available to use, and how did they achieve these effects? You feel a little like a detective because there's very little information about the process. This is one of the first ones that I realised that you could see they used a stencil.
Oh yeah, you can see it on the boot.
So when we finally got the original material into the lab and went through them one by one and to see what condition they're in, the first thing I wanted to do is get magnification and a torch and really have a close look.
So this is really helpful because we've got here all that is left of the long wall of the cloth hall. And this one is actually a Frank Hurley. So Collatz has actually hand coloured the original Hurley print, and it's amazing. So this is the medieval cloth hall that was pretty much completely devastated due to bombing. And this is incredible here, this lamppost that's been painted in this kind of aqua green, but it looks like it must be airbrushed because it kind of fades out to the bottom there and you can see the sepia print underneath.
Yes, it's definitely airbrushed, and what's interesting is even the small amounts of colour on the shoes and on the faces at the front, they're airbrushed as well. Airbrushing had been developed in the US in the late 19th century, so it's still fairly new commercially, and especially, you know, in a little studio in Melbourne. And the quality of the airbrushing is really quite impressive.
But what about here? You can see they've painted the caps, or is that it?
Yeah, you're right, well spotted. And then also the shadows, which is interesting.
Yeah.
They've actually got a single brush stroke of like a white, which is an interesting choice of colour to highlight the shadows.
There's such detail, and the length of time it would have taken this artist to actually minutely, you know, work on each shadow and each rock. It's quite extraordinary actually, isn't it?
Yeah, and obviously what they were thinking is the theatrical impact of when we stand back, because when I look up close, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense. But when you come back,
Absolutely.
you think, well, that's why they did that.
It is almost 3D because the soldiers are almost coming out of the page almost.
As the exhibition designer, this is probably the most exciting part of the process, because you get to work with the conservators and the curator and learn not only about the exhibition itself in its entirety, but every item in the exhibition and the details about that item.
So this is an interesting one.
Well, yeah, for one, you can see the airbrush
Well, that is,
trailing off.
yeah, that confirms your thoughts, Helen.
They're beautiful. They're something that I didn't expect at all. I think you look at them at first and you can't tell whether they are paintings or photographs, and when you actually listen to Helen dissect how these photographs were coloured, you then realise the amount of work and the techniques, and I think that's really special about this exhibition.
So ColArts, being a commercial studio, they were producing these prints, these reproductions, and colouring them, not only for exhibition, but they were selling copies of these prints. And you see that even in the ColArts exhibition catalogue. There's several pages where they're advertising that you too can have your own image. So in the mid-1920s, Joint sold a set to Anzac House, and I think that's where our collection has come from. So our collection may have hung on the walls in the RSL in Sydney at Anzac House for quite a while, which might explain the faded nature of many of them.
A lot of them have drips, large stains, a lot of surface grime, and then some of the bigger ones have very big tears. It's sort of nice that we've got a team of 6 conservators working on them, because they're pulling their ideas and doing different tests and seeing what will work, and so they can all share that.
Well, I've been working on this intermittently, but for about a week now. Mixing the colors for the infills, which are the areas that there were literally holes in. So those I've started to patch. I'm going to do 2 layers of tissue there. And then I'll be doing infill, touching up with watercolors, and that I'll just mix as I go in all these little cracks.
The main technique is to dye Japanese tissue. So there's this whole process where the conservators are experimenting with different colours and setting up all samples that they can then match to the different areas that they need to fill. And what they do is try to match sort of a mid-colour of the colours around it. Obviously, we're not trying to make up what's missing, but we just don't want to draw your eye to that spot. We want your eye just to be able to enjoy the whole work and not be focused on these areas of loss. It's very time consuming, and that's, at the moment, I think we've identified 20 that we've considered definitely need treatment to be stable enough to exhibit. And possibly 20-25 hours on each one. When you think we've got 151 of them, and times by 25 hours, some of them would be quicker treatments than others, but it's a massive project that will go beyond the exhibition itself. It has been an amazing process to watch, because the before and after can be quite significant and very gratifying. It's a very rewarding project for a conservator, because we are getting really nice results, and also they're such interesting and beautiful things to work on and to work with.
So the original exhibition had over 260 prints in it, and we only have 152. There are around 11 prints that the Australian War Memorial hold. Some of those are duplicates to what we have, but they also have some ones that we don't have. So it'll be really interesting to see the ones that are in Canberra. So I can see one immediately that looks very familiar to us at the State Library. So we've got this one here, a bunch of souvenirs. But I must say your ones here, your prints are much richer in colour. So this is one we don't have, Old Stick in the Mud. We've got a few of tanks on the Western Front. And I think it just sort of shows the incredible cumbersome nature of them.
Yes, I think they had initial impact because of their size and the noise that they made.
Right.
But I think overall it was a somewhat fraught piece of machinery.
Yeah.
And very interestingly, you can see the soldier having a good look at this very new technology. Many of the photographs, private photographs we have in our collection, actually show very similar things, that soldiers love to have their photographs taken with these tanks. So this is a really lovely close-up of the same thing.
Yeah.
We have some evidence of some soldiers from the Boer War having cameras, but I don't think it's anywhere near as common as it was in the First World War. I think by the time the First World War comes along, I think there's been a great expansion in photography knowledge. Cameras have become far more accessible to people. The marketing of the cameras kicked in, and certainly the vest pocket Kodak camera, of course, is something that was marketed to soldiers, the soldier's camera. And I think the soldiers going off to war, it was a natural thing to want to take a camera and record your own experience. It's rather nice that everyone wanted to record their moment of it.
We have many examples in the library's collection of these very small little prints that were produced from these soldiers' cameras. We have huge albums worth of the photographs they took in Egypt, and then of course as the troops move into the Western Front, we still have photographs of them in France and Belgium, and also in London when they go to London on leave. So they're still keeping their cameras, even though by the time Australian troops got to the Western Front, it was decreed that you were not allowed to have cameras for security purposes. But we have some extraordinary photographs of men in trenches in different parts of the Western Front, and even an extraordinary photograph of a stretcher bearer holding a white flag as they walk across sort of no man's land looking for wounded soldiers. So they were clearly still taking photographs, and apparently there were even camera clubs formed by soldiers serving on the Western Front.
So late in 1916, the appointment of the official Australian photographers happened, and from sort of late 1916, early 1917, you start having Hubert Wilkins and Frank Hurley, who are both polar explorers and adventurers, being appointed as Australian official photographers. And from that point onwards, you start getting a really substantial body of work that was created of the Australian experience on the Western Front.
Yeah, so here's another one on the left that we've got in our collection in Sydney. I mean, again, the colour is really rich. It gives a real feeling of the landscape and, you know, the use of these chemicals.
There's a lot of drama in this particular image for sure, and I think the colorisation really just enhances that one enormously. Colour photography in itself was quite unique. There were some colour negatives that were taken by Australian official photographers, but there was no coloured paper that could actually produce those images. And so the only way that a studio could actually produce those images was to hand colour. Many studios employed artists and produced a colourised version of a black and white image.
So this one on the right we don't have in our collection in Sydney, the charge of the light horse at Beersheba. So this is one I'm quite interested in looking at.
There is a bit of a story to this particular image because it portrays a really momentous event, purportedly anyway, and perhaps we should have a closer look at it.
Yeah, it's great.
The original image in our collection was in a series that was of donated prints, and in the caption it talks about the charge being an actual charge, except that it's a little unproven.
You can certainly see the men with their arms up heroic, you know, that whole idea of the glorious cavalry charge.
And of course, Australian light horse were not cavalry, they were mounted infantry.
Right.
And so the idea was to use their horses to get close enough, and then they would dismount and fight.
Yep.
But the viewing print that we have, obviously the same image, but it's black and white, but none of the explosions that you can see here are evident in this print. It certainly adds to the drama. Is it a reenactment or is it the real thing? The conventional feeling is that it is a reenactment. We sort of look at negatives as being an absolute record of a moment in time, but then you could also, as Frank Hurley did, start to incorporate other elements into photographs because he wanted through one image to tell a story that he felt would have better reception, say in the press, or so there's a famous photograph called The Hopover where you've got soldiers coming through a trench, you've got bombs exploding, and you've got all these aircraft flying over, and it's all kind of put together. It's the Photoshop of its day.
The official war historian, C.E.W. Bean, was very opposed to this practice of Hurley's, and there's parts of Hurley's diary where he talks about having arguments with Bean and them both storming off because Bean did not approve of this. Bean was very much a stickler for the truth, and he writes about this in his diaries, you know, justifying that he really wanted to explain to the Australian public really what it was like to be in the middle of a battle. But of course, a photographer can't be in the front lines in the middle of a battle and survive, let alone take photographs.
I mean, you might get a beautifully crafted official photograph and it's taken with all the skill and attention and care and so on that a professional photographer can bring. You can still get some very good soldier photography, but a lot of it's not. But it's not really about how perfect the image is, it's really about the story that it tells.
People are still really interested in colouring historical black and white photographs. And now with, you know, such amazing technology, people can get that exact colour of a ribbon or a jacket. There's that real feeling of authenticity. So this idea of, you know, going back in time and seeing for yourself or meeting this person for yourself, there's that real immediacy in it.
To complete a project like this, you do need something to drive you. But the angle I came from was, if I could wind back the clock 100 years, and I've got all these photos, and I go and see the diggers, and I go, look guys, I've got these photos of you guys. In 100 years' time, I'm going to publish a full colour book. Would you want to go in it? And, you know, I think they'd say, yeah, put me in. You know, there's over 200 individuals in this one, and how many different colours in the tunics did we use on this one?
We try and do at least maybe 4 or 5.
You watch a multi-million-dollar movie and all the soldiers on the front line are in the same tunics. They've all had the same tailor, but it wasn't like that. The AIF had multiple suppliers of tunics, so on the front line they weren't all in the same exact identical colours. Sure, we used creative licence with, say for example, there might be some vehicles in there, some of the ladies' dresses, you know, we just had to at that point. But when it came to their patches, their boots, their belts, their buckles, we were quite particular about that.
These days, Photoshop is very cut and paste. You can stop and start, you can undo, if you make a mistake, you can take it back. These guys wouldn't have had that. These guys were painting and, you know, doing it all by hand. What they did was permanent. I think there's a lot more guts in what they did than this process. Yeah.
We worked on over 400 images, 5 to 10 hours each, some more, some less. It took 5 years. It was a long, hard process to do, but in a way that was our commitment to the commemoration. I've had people say, that photo looks like it was taken yesterday. And I go, yes, that's what I wanted to achieve. It makes you realise they're just like you and me. As for the Collatz collection, when I first heard about it, I actually thought, well, what a great way to grieve for the community. You know, they can go to these shows and view where their loved ones were lost. It must have been dreadfully emotional. You know, in a period where tens of thousands didn't return, tens of thousands returned in a dreadful state, and millions suffered. I just hope that it helped.
So the exhibition, we understand, was very well received. You see reviews in many major daily newspapers as well as regional newspapers talking about the images are so realistic, and there's often quotes by eminent people, often retired officers, and of course they say, well, I was there and I can say that these truly are, exact representations of what we saw. I find that interesting, particularly in the 1920s. You might have thought that the Australian public was sort of sick of war, not wanting to see these sort of images, but there was obviously a real interest.
People respond differently, I think, to exhibitions than perhaps reading a book. And I think having the opportunity to see all these images in one spot must have been a wonderful sort of experience. And I think colorising, made those images quite special. And trying to bring the Western Front into Australia in a way that could help people understand what had happened and what the environment was like, what the landscape was like, and how their sons, brothers, fathers, uncles and so on had operated in that environment.